In September 2016, in the bustling Gangnam area of Jamwon Ward, Seocho District, the capital Seoul, South Korea, a serious incident occurred. During the surgery, both responsible doctors left the facility, leaving the patient in a critical blood loss condition under the supervision of nurses. Instead of focusing on saving the patient, the nurses were preoccupied with applying makeup and staring at their mobile phones. Blood was spilling all over the floor to the extent that they had to clean it up to 13 times, but no one was truly paying attention to the danger threatening the patient's life. Many people are aware that South Korea is renowned for its extremely high beauty standards, with the rate of cosmetic surgery among its population ranking among the highest in the world. According to data from the International Association of Aesthetic Surgery, when you set foot in Seoul and enter any subway station, you will be surrounded by advertisements for cosmetic surgery. Before and after images of numerous women are displayed everywhere, accompanied by the message, "You too can become beautiful." This trend is not only prevalent among women. South Korean men are also increasingly interested in enhancing their appearance to become more attractive. According to a study by the Korea Herald website, up to 44% of South Korean male students have undergone cosmetic surgery, and the victim in this story was among them. Let's rewind to Friday night, September 9th, 2016. The phone of a man named T-Hun suddenly rang. On the other end of the line, a voice asked if he was Kwon Dae-hee's brother. After T-Hun confirmed, the caller delivered shocking news. His brother was in the emergency room and needed him to come immediately. Stunned by this information, T-Hun had no idea what had happened to his brother. However, the caller reassured him that Dae-hee's condition was not too serious, which provided him some relief. On his way to the hospital, T-Hun thought perhaps his brother had been drunk and got into a fight with someone, so he planned to scold him severely for this. But upon arrival and being led by a nurse to Dae-hee's hospital bed, he was shocked to see his 25-year-old brother lying motionless, his body hooked up with numerous IV lines, blood transfusions, and a breathing tube. At that moment, Hun realized that Dae-hee's condition was far more critical than what he had been told. Panicked, he immediately called his mother, Mrs. Lee Na-gum. Upon receiving the urgent call from her eldest son, she hurried to the hospital. When she met T-Hun on the 3rd floor, where Dae-hee was in the intensive care unit, Mrs. Lee couldn't believe her eyes as she saw her youngest son lying critically ill, his life at risk. She couldn't fathom that the son who had just told her he was going to stay at a friend's house for a few days was now unconscious in a hospital bed. At that moment, a doctor approached and informed her that Dae-hee had suffered massive hemorrhage during the cosmetic surgery, his condition very serious and possibly fatal. Hearing this, Mrs. Lee couldn't stand and collapsed on the spot. She was in shock and immense pain upon learning that her son had secretly undergone cosmetic surgery without informing the family, only to suffer such a horrific accident. Shortly after, T-Hun's close friend also arrived at the hospital and shared insights about Dae-hee. He described Dae-hee as a warm and humble young man who, despite his excellent academic achievements, always felt incomplete due to insecurity about his jawline. Since high school, Dae-hee was frequently teased and bullied by friends for his facial imperfections. Whenever he took photos, he always tried to hide his jawline or used editing apps to remove the sharp angles he considered unattractive. Upon reaching the age of 25, having just completed his military service and preparing to start his career, Dae-hee's self-consciousness about his appearance still haunted him. Determined to change himself, he decided to undergo cosmetic surgery to reshape his jawline, despite his close friends' attempts to dissuade him, assuring him that there was nothing significantly wrong with his face. Nevertheless, Dae-hee remained steadfast in his decision. To afford the surgery, which cost over 6 million won, he took on various jobs and even limited himself to eating only one meal a day to save money. Once he had secured the necessary funds, Dae-hee thoroughly researched and ultimately chose a cosmetic clinic with the enticing slogan, 14 years without a single cosmetic accident. The clinic was located in the bustling Gangnam area, renowned for its numerous large aesthetic centers. Before entering the operating room, Dae-hee cheerfully took photos and sent them to his close friend, unaware that the surgery he eagerly anticipated would not only fail to deliver the desired results but also bring him to the brink of death. Facing his worried mother over his son's critical condition, the hospital doctors delivered devastating news. If lucky, Dae-hee might survive, but would have to live as a vegetative being. If not, he could die within the next week. One doctor even uttered a line that Mrs. Lee would never forget: "You might consider donating your son's organs to help other patients." Meanwhile, the doctors who performed Dae-hee's surgery at the cosmetic clinic had not yet appeared, despite Mrs. Wasson, Lee and Ti-hun waiting throughout the night. It wasn't until the next morning that Mr. Jang, the director of the aesthetic facility and the surgeon who operated on Dae-hee, finally showed up. However, he did not come to express concern for Dae-hee's condition, but rather to justify that Dae-hee was not in danger at his clinic. He claimed that the excessive bleeding was due to Dae-hee's jaw being larger than average, and that the blood loss in that area was not severe enough to cause harm. Mr. Jang even offered to provide the surgery's CCTV footage if there were any doubts. In contrast, the hospital provided information indicating that the cosmetic clinic had significant issues. When Dae-hee was transferred, he was already in a severe state of blood loss, necessitating urgent blood transfusions. However, upon examination, the hospital found no signs that Dae-hee had received any blood transfusions prior to his transfer. This information was quickly relayed to the police. When investigators questioned Dr. Jang, he stated, "We contacted the blood bank to request blood, but the hospital's ambulance arrived first, so we couldn't transfuse blood to Dae-hee." However, this testimony did not align with the facts, as the blood intended for transfusion had already been delivered to the cosmetic clinic just 4 minutes before the ambulance arrived. This means the doctors at the clinic had the means to transfuse blood to Dae-hee, but chose not to. 18 days had passed since the horrific incident, coinciding with Dae-hee's 26th birthday. He still clung to life, while his mother and brother never gave up hope, despite the doctors repeatedly stating that Dae-hee's chances of recovery were almost non-existent. On this special day, Dae-hee lay motionless in the ICU as his mother and brother organized a heartbreaking birthday celebration, tears streaming down their faces. Shortly after, Director Jang returned for another visit. Instead of showing concern, he continued to insist that his clinic was not at fault. Even more arrogantly, he shifted the blame to the hospital and advised Mrs. Lee to sue them. Mrs. Lee, at this point solely concerned about her son's survival, was furious to hear such meaningless words and demanded that Mr. Jang stop exacerbating her family's suffering. On October 25, 2016, just one day after Director Jang's visit to the cosmetic clinic, Dae-hee's heart stopped beating. No miracle occurred. His tragic story quickly spread through the media, raising widespread concerns about the cosmetic surgery industry in South Korea. Despite the tragedy reaching its peak, the cosmetic clinic continued to operate unabashedly with the claim, 14 years without a single accident. Moreover, they falsely advertised that the clinic director personally performed all surgeries, completely contradicting what Dae-hee had experienced. Faced with this heartbreaking situation, Mrs. Lee was determined not to let everything pass by silently. She decided to file a lawsuit against the medical staff of the cosmetic clinic, the very people who had caused her son to pass away forever. From there, she began uncovering the horrifying truths about what her son had endured during the 11 hours he lay on the life-or-death operating table. Firstly, Mrs. Lee demanded that Mr. Jang provide all documents related to the surgical contract between the clinic and Dae-hee, along with the CCTV footage from the operating room on that day. After obtaining the paperwork and video, she swiftly handed them over to a relative knowledgeable in both medicine and law for support. This relative, after reviewing the video, suggested that Mrs. Lee watch it together. Despite knowing it would be extremely painful, she understood that it was the only way to uncover the truth. The CCTV footage, lasting 7 hours and 13 minutes, recorded the entire sequence of events in the operating room. Mrs. Lee watched every second attentively, enduring immense pain as she saw her son being slowly drained of life without any dedicated assistance from the so-called doctors. She even watched the footage over 500 times, meticulously noting every detail to accuse the cosmetic clinic of committing a crime. The surgery began with anesthetist Dr. Lee and the lead surgeon, Mr. Jang, entering the operating room. After 30 minutes of anesthesia, Mr. Jang commenced the jaw surgery on Dae-hee. However, unexpectedly, blood began to gush out profusely, flooding the surgical floor. The nurses calmly used a mop to clean the patient's blood, doing so a total of 13 times. They kept mopping repeatedly until the mop could no longer completely clean the blood from the floor, indicating that the patient had lost a significant amount of blood. 1 hour later, while Dae-hee was still lying there with his wound yet to be sutured, Mr. Jang abruptly left the operating room. Another doctor stepped in to staunch the bleeding for Dae-hee. Through the clumsy actions of this doctor, Mrs. Lee realized that he was the ghost doctor, causing outrage among the South Korean public at the time. Explanation of the term ghost doctor. Famous plastic surgeons often leverage the fame of K-pop stars or other celebrities to advertise their clinics. However, during busy times, the limited number of doctors cannot handle the overwhelming number of patients, especially when the main doctors need to be present to consult with new clients. This is when ghost doctors appear. Ghost doctors are a way for clinics to maximize profits by having another doctor illegally replace the clinic's renowned doctors, those whom customers have trusted and entrusted their lives to, only to ultimately deceive them. While the ghost doctor continued to try to staunch the bleeding for Dae-hee, footage from a second CCTV angle showed Dr. Jang moving to a nearby operating room to perform another cosmetic surgery. This was a severe violation of medical regulations, as doctors are not permitted to perform multiple surgeries simultaneously without authorization and ensuring the safety of all patients involved. Shockingly, during the investigation, the police discovered that at that time, Dr. Jang was not only involved in 2 but 3 surgeries simultaneously, including Dae-hee's. After the makeshift bandaging, the ghost doctor and anesthetist Dr. Lee left the room, leaving Dae-hee under the supervision of a nurse. The CCTV footage showed that Dae-hee's condition was worsening. His jaw wound continued to bleed incessantly, causing the medical bandages to be soaked in red blood. However, what was even more infuriating was that the nurse assigned to monitor him was completely indifferent. Instead of attending to the patient, she casually changed her clothes, sat by the head of the bed to check her mirror, reapply lipstick, and browse her phone. There was no sign of concern or emergency action. This critical situation persisted until the nurse finally called the ghost doctor and Dr. Lee back to Dae-hee's operating room. Meanwhile, Dr. Jang, the main surgeon responsible for the operation, had disappeared without a trace. From the CCTV footage, it was evident that the ghost doctor was making crucial decisions on the spot, decisions that should have been made by Dr. Jang. Moreover, this ghost doctor went as far as injecting a solution into Dae-hee's ankle, a procedure only authorized doctors with proper licenses from the Ministry of Health are permitted to perform. At this moment, Dae-hee's life was hanging by a thread, yet astonishingly, everyone present in the room appeared completely relaxed, even engaging in cheerful conversations, as if nothing was happening. During the first court session, Dae-hee's mother spent over 30 minutes condemning the appearance of the ghost doctor, a person who was entirely unqualified to perform her son's surgery. The second individual, Mr. Shin, entered the room to continue the surgery, who was, in reality, only an anesthetist from another hospital and did not have the qualifications or licenses to perform such a critical surgery. In response to the severe accusations from the victim's family, Dr. Lee explained, "When the emergency situation arose and urgent action was needed, I sought the help of an anesthetist I know, Mr. Shin, to ensure we had enough staff. The goal was to implement the necessary medical measures for the patient as quickly as possible." However, Mrs. Lee, Dae-hee's mother, immediately refuted this explanation, arguing that Dr. Shin had exceeded the scope of allowable assistance by deeply participating in the surgery and handling the transportation and blood transfusion for her son. Additionally, she accused anesthetist Dr. Lee of unreasonable delays in the emergency response process. She pointed out that when informed of Dae-hee's critical condition, Dr. Lee returned to the operating room at 22:40, but only called emergency services at 23:27, nearly a 47-minute delay. When questioned about Dr. Shin, Kim, the director of the cosmetic clinic and the lead surgeon of the operation, shook his head and admitted, "I don't know who he is. The anesthetist director at my hospital knows him, but I do not." However, I believe that Dr. Lee made a swift decision in this critical moment to save the patient's life. The involvement of an anesthetist from another hospital, someone even the cosmetic clinic director does not clearly know, who could significantly influence decisions regarding blood transfusions and subsequent emergency patient transfers, was truly shocking to both the aesthetic industry and the South Korean public at the time. This revelation made those considering cosmetic surgery rethink their decisions. Director Kim, the former legal director of the International Association of Aesthetic Surgeons in South Korea, shared his perspective on the matter. Patients trust their surgeons and undergo surgeries at clinics, but it is unacceptable for an external anesthetist to participate and make decisions during cosmetic surgery procedures. Who is responsible in such cases? I do not understand why they are willing to proceed with surgeries under such unclear circumstances. And this is not the only issue. The fact that Dae-hee lost 3,500 cc of blood, approximately 70% of the normal blood volume in a human body, a level well above what can cause death during surgery, and subsequently died from brain injuries, has raised significant questions for investigators and prosecutors alike. Notably, throughout this process, Dae-hee did not receive any additional blood transfusions, even though the blood had been delivered to the cosmetic clinic 4 minutes before he was transported to the hospital. This only heightened the suspicions regarding the responsibility and professionalism of those involved. In the face of heavy accusations from the victim's family, Director Jang explained to them, "When the 2 blood samples were transferred, I asked whether we should wait for the ambulance to arrive, and Mr. Shin agreed. Afterwards, the ambulance took the patient away." However, this testimony revealed that Dr. Jang, along with anesthetist Dr. Lee, had handed over critical decisions regarding the patient's condition to Mr. Shin, an anesthetist from another hospital who had no role at the cosmetic clinic. Confronted with this distressing truth, Mrs. Lee could not contain her anger and strongly objected. "I do not understand why the doctors at the clinic would allow an external doctor to decide whether or not to transfuse blood to their patients, especially when the patient is in a critical condition." She added, "I saw those who were called doctors standing there, arrogantly smiling in front of my son, who was lying helpless, while the blood had been delivered for emergency transfusion, yet they neglected to transfuse it to Dae-hee from our family." In the court trial, all medical staff at the cosmetic clinic were charged. However, key figures such as Director Kim, Dr. Jang, and the ghost doctor Mr. Shin steadfastly denied any involvement in Dae-hee's death. Even more surprising was that the prosecutor handling this case continuously dismissed the family's accusations. He did not even conduct a thorough investigation into the cause of Dae-hee's blood loss or determine who was primarily responsible. Unable to tolerate the injustice any longer, Dae-hee's mother decided to file a petition with the Supreme Court to oppose the prosecution's charges, claiming they were unfair and based on unconvincing evidence. Simultaneously, she began organizing solo protests in front of the courthouse and the prosecutor's office, calling for public attention and support. Thanks to her relentless efforts, the police later transferred the case to new prosecutors, with charges of professional negligence leading to death in violation of medical laws. According to regulations, doctors can have their licenses revoked if convicted of violating medical laws. However, the prosecutor continued to dismiss the medical law violation charges, claiming insufficient evidence, despite clear evidence that the anesthetist had participated in medical procedures without a legitimate license. Mrs. Lee did not give up. She continued to seek evaluations from professional agencies and received 12 reports from 6 agencies, confirming that the cosmetic clinic had seriously violated medical laws. Nevertheless, the prosecution still refused to acknowledge these findings. During this process, Mrs. Lee discovered a heartbreaking truth. The prosecutor handling this case and the cosmetic clinic's lawyer were schoolmates, even having studied together at the Institute of Judicial Research and Training. This connection not only increased her dissatisfaction, but also raised suspicions about transparency and fairness in the judicial process. Mrs. Lee's battle to reclaim justice had become more complicated than ever, as she had to face manipulation and collusion among the involved parties. Without a charge, the case could not proceed, so Mrs. Lee decided to file a petition to review the judicial system, hoping that the court would order the prosecution of those involved. However, the chances of this petition succeeding were only about 0.3%. In the face of immense difficulties and despair, Mrs. Lee visited her son's grave every day, unable to hold back her tears as she prayed for Dae-hee, helping her maintain her faith and determination to fight for justice. Mrs. Lee never gave up. Day after day, she persistently organized solitary protests on the streets, right in front of the courthouse and the prosecutor's office, demonstrating unwavering determination and relentless patience. After 416 days of fighting alone, a miracle finally happened in May 2019. The court agreed to order the prosecution of the suspects as requested by Mrs. Lee. In the trial, the court accepted the charges of violating medical laws and manslaughter against the medical staff of the cosmetic clinic. The judicial authorities recognized Mrs. Lee's pain and relentless efforts, but the outcome was still incomplete, as only the clinic director was sentenced to prison, while the other doctors were merely fined. Unsatisfied with this verdict, Mrs. Lee continued her appeals. In 2020, the appellate court imposed a harsher sentence compared to the first trial. However, this time, although the medical staff admitted the facts, they still refused to accept responsibility for their negligence and continued to appeal against the victim's family. Additionally, Dahi's family received compensation of 430 million won, based on the assumption that Dahi would have lived and worked until the age of 65. By January 2023, the Supreme Court had rendered the final verdict in this case. The judge confirmed the charges against the defendants, sentencing Surgeon Zhang to 3 years in prison and a fine of 10 million won. The other medical staff, including anesthetist Dr. Lee and Mr. Shin, received suspended sentences. Although Mrs. Lee's 7-year-long battle to reclaim justice seemed to have achieved some results, her mission was not yet complete. While sorting through Dahi's belongings, she discovered a piece of paper listing 20 wishes her son had written before his death, including the line, "Leave a mark on the world with my name." Driven by the desire to fulfill her son's wish, Mrs. Lee resolved to become the head of an organization supporting victims of medical accidents and actively advocated for the installation of surveillance cameras in operating rooms. Her relentless efforts finally bore fruit when on September 25, 2023, a new law was passed mandating the installation of surveillance cameras in all operating rooms in South Korea. Mrs. Lee, the Great Mother, had fulfilled her son's dream, leaving a profound mark on the world. Meanwhile, the clinic where the incident occurred continued to operate, likely under a different name, to avoid its tarnished reputation. As many cosmetic surgery clinics do after facing tragedies, they often change their names and continue their business as if nothing had happened. Operating rooms are closed environments, making it very difficult to reveal what happens inside. Even now, there may be someone in a cosmetic surgery clinic undergoing a procedure under the hands of a dangerous ghost doctor. Due to numerous shortcomings in supervision and management, illegal cosmetic surgeries are still happening, have happened, and continue to occur, not only in South Korea but in many other parts of the world. Therefore, anyone considering cosmetic surgery should carefully choose only truly reputable establishments to avoid falling victim to scams and suffering injuries. What are your thoughts on this case? Share your opinions in the comments below so we can discuss together. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next exciting cases on the murder documentary Tony channel. Thank you, and see you in the next stories.